Next chapter is entitled The Elohim's Die. And it's got the Hebrew word for it, which looks like it's pronounced Asaph le Mizmor or Mizmor. This chapter will analyze Psalm 82 and 83 of the Bible. This psalm was composed by Asaph, son of Berkyahu, descendant of Gershom, Moses' oldest son. Asaph lived during the age of David and was the head of one of the early groups of musicians who depended directly on the sovereign. This important position allowed him to sit with the king. He had been assigned 12 psalms written during the reign of Hezekiah the 8th, in the 8th century BCE. The Levites, members of the priestly tribe, praised Yahweh with the words of David and Asaph the seer. So Asaph was a man who occupied a prominent position close to the centers of power and knowledge management, a man of learning, dedicated to the in-depth examination of the ancient text and the composition of songs and praise. He is credited with this psalm that includes the astonishing, quite puzzling statement. The poem contains the description of an assembly of gods chaired by one who is reproaching the rest of them for the unacceptable behavior in administering their powers over men. He seems to be reading, as in other passages of the Old Testament, the transcription of the Sumerian tale, a description of one of many meetings during which the Anunnaki administered power and justice in the territories assigned to them. And this next part in the square box here is entitled Sumerian Parallels. The parliamentary form and the need to govern justly find interesting records among the Sumerians. Regarding parliamentary structures, it seemed that around 3000 BCE it appeared in the city of Uruk, the biblical Ur or Erech. A first form of structure appeared consisting of two rooms that were convened to discuss whether or not to go to war. It sounds kind of like the Pentagon over here in the United States. Buildings where the governments wage war on people. That's where we get all this stuff from, by the way. Like everything we have, like these systems of governments and the right to rule through kings and queens or presidents or bishops, all this stuff all traces back to the Anunnaki. It was all passed on from them to us over thousands of years. With reference to the need to lead a good government, quote unquote, this psalm mentions the extraordinary behavior of the Sumerian king named Uruk-Ganina. Sorry, let me try it again. Uruk-Kagina, Urukagina, who was supposedly around during the years 2600 through 2300 BCE, that was his ruling years. Uruk-Kagina was not willing to tolerate any more abuses of that period's reformed the legal system, which claimed to have been commissioned directly by quote-unquote God. And then it says God Ningirsu. Uruk-Kagina was king governor of the city of Lagash in Mesopotamia and became famous for his reforms against corruption and the measures taken in favor of the lower classes. He exempted widows and orphans from taxation. See, they had taxation like thousands of years ago. Like I said, like everything we have, this whole idea of taxing people and ripping people off, this all dates back to the Anunnaki. Charged this. Okay, so again, sorry, let me read it again. He exempted widows and orphans from taxation, charged the city with the duty to pay funeral expenses, forced rich people to use silver in purchasing with the poor, and also decided that people could not be forced to sell their property against their will. His code is also known for the attention given to the situation of women who drew substantial benefits in terms of civil and social recognition. So even back then, it sounds like, they had silver, which is like a form of real money. Real money is precious metals. Real money is weighed, not counted like our fake dollars, like people count their fake dollars today. Real money is weighed in grams and ounces and pounds and kilos. Gold, silver, copper, platinum. And according to this, it sounds like if he was, making the rich people pay the poor people in silver, well, were they trying to force the poor people to also transact with fake money like they do today with the United States dollar, which all the poor citizen slaves transact with? In the early verses of Psalm 82 and 83, it is said that Elohim sits in the assembly of El, in parentheses it says that is the singular form. The singular form is here used to designate the supreme God, and is pronouncing his sentence in the presence of other Elohims. His colleagues are clearly of a lower rank. So we have some gods partaking in an assembly convened by an El, the supreme God. Just like we have these governments today doing their assemblies, and they're all of different ranks. You got the presidents, the vice presidents, the mayors, the secretary of state, you got all these ranks. See, the same stuff has been going on, and it all traces back to the Anunnaki. The Elohim who chairs the meeting calls his colleagues to have respect for justice and rebukes them because they pronounce unjust judgments and are on the side of the wicked. He reminds them of the duty to defend the weak, the poor, and the orphaned, to take care of and the destitute, and in short, to fulfill the precepts the Anunnaki had dictated to the power managers they had appointed. After these calls, the editor introduces a personal account underlying that these Elohims do not understand, cannot understand, and then the chairman takes the floor to say in a peremptory and menacing tone, and then this is going for verse 6 and 7, and it's giving us the whole Hebrew translation, all the different words translated in Hebrew that he says here with this menacing tone. I have said that you Elohim and the sons of the highest Lord, in parentheses the one who is very high, you too will certainly die like an atom, and like one of the heads you will fall. Exactly, the Elohims, even the Elohims, are destined sooner or later to die. This is much different than what the traditional Christian religious institutions teach. They teach that God can never die. He is eternal. All right here, right here we got the Hebrew translation stating the exact opposite. They say it themselves. Who chairs the assembly says this to remind them that even if they are Elohims or lords from above, they do not have any special right or extraordinary privilege. Certainly, they are masters, those in power, the guardians. Once again, we remember the words from Sumar, land of the guardians, and Nitiru, the guardians of the early Egypt. It is important to note that this status does not make them substantially different from their creatures. The creatures, the ones that are genetically modified. They must not forget that they too are mortal and fleeting, just like the representative of the world that they had themselves set up. Then, with no alternative interpretations or fanciful assumptions, very simply and clearly, the Elohims die, like the atoms. It comes as no surprise to anyone who speculates that Anunnaki Elohims could have a long life, incredibly long compared to the earthly cycles, for it was measured on Nibiru's orbital cycles. But that, as the people made of flesh and blood, they too were meant to die. It is simply astonishing that the Bible itself says so. So remember, Nibiru's orbital cycle, it's an elliptical orbit that takes about, I think, 3,600 years to complete, if I'm not mistaken. So, this is like, it gets into like the law of relativity, physics and stuff like that, that when you're on these other planets with these longer orbits, in theory, hypothetically speaking, you live longer. Or potentially it could even have been a different genetic trait. They might their DNA might have been different, and they may have even been able to extend their lifespan. So in the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, the Emerald Tablets, and it's actually going to mention that over here. It talks about Thoth. Hermes Trismegistus is Thoth. They said that Thoth was actually an immortal. He had like regeneration chambers that was able to extend his lifespan indefinitely. But that doesn't mean they couldn't die. Like, you could still potentially kill these people. I mean, if you cut off their head, they're dead. All right, let's continue. So this next part says, inspired by God or by Thoth. I've done a lot of videos on Thoth the Atlantean, who is also Hermes Trismegistus from the Greeks. We have addressed that the issue of the origin of religion as the possible result of historical events, real experiences, and concrete and tangible relationships with some gods. Keeping the hypothesis validated, in the previous chapters we now look at the development of the religious thought when gods did not walk with men anymore. When direct contact eased, mankind likely felt abandoned and overwhelmed by anxiety and despair arising from God's evident remoteness. So men, the atoms, in parentheses, felt the need to replace their God's physical absence with a new presence, though, of course, they had to create it anew, and certainly it was not an easy task. In this regard, we will examine in particular the possible origin of the most mystic Christian text, the Gospel of John. Before deepening into this subject, which will lead us into formulate an answer to the question, inspired by God or inspired by Thoth. Let's analyze some helpful issues for a correct understanding of the process that most probably led to the birth of Western religious thought. If you ever read the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, you'll realize that pretty much every single religion on this planet is just a spin-off of what's taught in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, which is one of the most occult works of literature that exists on this planet. I mean, that I've ever heard of. The Freemasons, all Freemasonry is based on it. The Church and the Aliens is the next section here. What does the Catholic Church say in relation to the existence of extraterrestrials and the fact that the Bible talks about them? Not everyone knows that nowadays the Church has admitted so obvious the existence of extraterrestrials. Monsignor Corrado Balducci, Vatican spokesman for the extraterrestrials issue, claimed that they do exist and that the Bible editors undoubtedly knew about them. During an interview, he expressly stated not to believe in UFOs as the presence of other living beings is a sin. Their existence is not only proven by about a million witnesses, including those of many atheist scientists, but it is also confirmed by some passages in the scriptures that clarify some points about their presence. He then added, Psalm 23 reads, "The earth is the Lord and everything in it, the world, the universe, and all who live in it." Now, after citing the earth, why should the psalmist also quote the universe and all who live in it? This means that the presence of other living beings is taken for granted. Even theology agrees with this thesis. The exegete, or the exegete father, Aristide Serra, professor of the Marianum University of Rome, specified that in the word universe, written 66 times in the Bible, the presence of the other inhabited worlds is implicit and obvious. Some theologians highlight two more quotations recalling the same conviction. In the book of Psalm and in the book of John, it says, "Let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad. I have other sheep that are not of this fold, I must bring them also." Cardinal Nicola Cusano, 15th century philosopher and scientist, has said, no star by which we are entitles us to exclude the existence of beings though different from us. I hate when I don't know why they make the writing like super small in some of these quotes. It's like really hard to read. Father Angelo Secchi, a Jesuit and astronomer who died in 1876, has written, "It is absurd to consider the world around us like a huge uninhabitable desert and be searching for the meaning of the universe solely in our small town world." When Padre Pio of Pietrelcina was asked if aliens really existed, he replied, "God's omnipotence is not confined to the sole planet Earth. On other planets, there are creatures and beings who have not sinned like us and that pray to God." Reverend Desailly of Munich, attending a conference of theologians and sociologists, said that the Earth comes from under scrutiny by intelligent beings from other planets. Men are to prepare for the encounter with these beings. The Jesuit astronomer José Luis Funes, director of the Vatican Observatory, explicitly states its firm belief in the existence of extraterrestrials and also says that one day we will meet the aliens as brothers. No coincidence. Then, if in November 2009 at Casino Pio 4, during the astrology week of studies promoted by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the 8th session was entitled Intelligence Elsewhere and Shadow Life and was about the assumption of the existence of forms of sentient life in other worlds and the possible presence of life forms other than ours inside of our own world. Father Funes himself believes that the question concerning the origin of life and its existence elsewhere in the universe are very interesting and worth serious consideration, and that such questions have many philosophical and theological implications. So remember, Mauro Baglino worked for the Vatican as a translator. That's why he has all these contexts of the astrologers from the Vatican and all these other people that do these speeches and all these researchers. I'm sure that's where he's getting these quotes, is because he's in these inner circles of all these other people that work in the Vatican studying this stuff. That's why I wanted to read this book, because like this dude actually has the authority to teach what was really written in the Bible. All these 35K, 45K salary slaves working the 9-to-5 jobs, teaching this shit in public school, they know nothing. They're like parrots. They're just mindlessly regurgitating a bunch of gibberish that's been mistranslated. We are absolutely convinced of the reasonables of Father Funes and Balducci's assertions, and compared to the only psalm quoted by him, Psalm 23, this book has provided much more extensive and documented evidence of the fact that the writers of the Bible really knew aliens. The encounters with the alien brothers predicted by the astronomer Funes, as well as Reverend Dessauer, how do you pronounce that, has most likely already taken place, and the Bible clearly accounts it. So even the Catholic Church has admitted that the Bible writers were familiar with extraterrestrials. The next logical and desirable step forward would be to give up the forcibly spiritualistic version and try to read the Bible for what it is, a history book which was written using the cultural linguistic categories of the time. A question: if the God traditionally regarded as the source of Judeo-Christian religious thought, in fact, turns out to be nothing more than an individual, or rather a group of individuals of flesh and bones that have shaped man with their image and resemblance, where does the inspiration of the text at the basis of the entire Western civil religion come from? In other words, on what basis was Christianity actually established? In the attempt to find an answer to the question about the inspiration, we will soon examine what has been traditionally considered by far the most inspired text of Christianity, the mystical text par excellence, the one that more than any other appears pervaded by divine influence, the Christian writings closest to the agnostic spirituality, the Gospel of John. The next section is entitled Hellenism. The period of Greek history, from the expedition of Alexander the Great to Asia up to the undisputed assertion of the primacy of Rome, or approximately from 200 or 323 to 31 BC, is called the Hellenistic period. The merits of Alexander the Great. Alexander's conquest had expanded the boundaries of the known world and simultaneously opened new opportunities for trade, knowledge, movement. They had also favored the information of new markets, providing unimagined development for many territories. Ideas could circulate more freely and quickly. Culture assumed a universal character. Trends integrated, and a desire to learn spread across a new region. A new language, cohesion, was born through the transformation of the classical Greek into a koine dialectos, namely a new common language. It was certainly less rich than the previous one, but more easily accessible to the educated classes that were substantially expanding. This language became the new vehicle for the propagation of religious ideas, doctrines, and philosophical literary works. See, the language itself just became a propaganda machine. And that eventually evolved into what we're speaking now, English. Alexander's death was followed by a very confused period during which the previous political military order disappeared, and through wars and unrest, 3 large state-owned units established: Macedonia, Syria, and Ptolemy's Egypt. In those years, from a political and social standpoint, a number of centuries-old certainties guaranteeing the stability of previous systems fell. For example, the structure of the Greek cities disappeared. There was an emancipation of women and a simultaneous collapse of the family institution. Even religion was hit by this wave of innovation. Greek polis gods almost disappeared. But the need for religion was still great, and the people took over the cults of the conquered populations. The diffusion of the mystery and the orgiastic rites, as well as the worship of Mesopotamian and Middle Eastern deities, including the Jewish religion, would proliferate. Greeks found out that the new gods were not so much different from those they worshipped, and this brought about an exchange and a mixture of beliefs, rituals, and formulas, opening the way for one of the key features of Hellenistic religiosity: syncretism, or the combining of different beliefs. You notice right over here where it says, a few sentences up, it says, but the need for religion was still great, and the people took over the cults and conquered, or the people took over the cults of the conquered populations. You see, whoever wins the war rewrites history. That's why history is spelled as his story. Well, who writes his story? Whoever wins the war rewrites history the way they see fit to serve their agenda, which is also, to conquer and dominate and enslave. That's why history is spelled as his story. That's why all this has been removed from the Bible. That's why none of this was taught in school, because the conquerors of the United States rewrote history. We can summarize that in centuries immediately preceding the coming of Christ, from the religious point of view, culture abandoned any logical and rational approach that had been typical of the Greeks. With the consequential development of creed, dogmatic, and universalistic doctrines. The period of great and original speculations ended with no prominent figures. Tradition was being reanalyzed and reprocessed. Original doctrines were replaced by the examination of those truths, and that had been already discovered and asserted. The sometimes rigid dogmatism and a lack of confidence in the ability of human reason generated a reaction that resulted in skepticism, claiming the impossibility of grasping a thing's true meaning. The new trend led to the abandonment of the philosophical speculation and developed mysticism as a way to realize those truths precluded to rationality. They came to say that the knowledge was found in ancient revelations contained in texts whose authority could not be discussed, and that these truths could only be grasped through mystical ecstasy that allows the initiate direct contact with deity. What a load of shit. That's just like censorship. Thus, the civilization of this period, after the fall of centralist kingdoms and polis, the polis was scattered and with no points of reference left. That period was marked by a form of religious and cultural syncretism, through which the different cultures complemented each other, remodeled and molded into different forms, all based on hitherto unknown universalism. New demands. As it happens in moments of great confusion and uncertainty, religion turns to gods with different, very concrete intentions, much more oriented to the satisfaction of new needs. The gods are asked to play the part of the quote-unquote savior. Now, down here it says Latin evidence. During the period we find some examples, obviously pagan, referring to this heartfelt need for peace and certain unambiguous and definitive salvation. On a marble pillar set in a Roman temple in Asia Minor, we read the following words referred to the Emperor Caesar Augustus. I was doing the really tiny words again. Providence has enriched our lives with the greatest of gifts, and in her mercy it has provided us and those to come with a Savior who will bring order and peace, news for the world. At the same time, the poet Virgil, great interpreter of the period's thought, in the fourth eclogue, described the birth of a child who would live in a world filled with peace and the utmost harmony. I am reddit it et Virgo redeunt Saturnia regna. Then in parentheses it says the Virgin is back now, and back are the reigns of Saturn. But you, Castlicinia, be appropriate for a child who is coming, and in the whole world there will be a golden race. So it looks like he's translating. I think that's Latin that he was translating there. The revelation, however, also has a universal value. It is about every man and offered to all those who want it. It is the chance to attain the spiritual growth which enables their soul to be finally reunited with God from whence it came. Esotericism. The term esotericism normally refers to a set of secret teachings that are often inaccessible even to the initiates themselves. In this case, they are worshipped without trying to penetrate their wisdom. Much more often, the teachings are secret because this knowledge is only taught within esoterikos, which is the circle of teachers' disciples, and cannot be disclosed publicly. Teachings like magic, the mysteriosophic religion, and chemistry were considered esoteric, and that is, they were transmitted only to those disciples who were deemed capable of understanding and therefore worthy of receiving knowledge. You see, this is the control of information. Whoever controls the available information can control the consciousness of the species, and that's exactly what they're talking about here. It's the same thing that's used today in the United States. The corpus hermeticum. In this cultural and religious environment, we find the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, who is a master with language, bearer of logos, which creates and orders creation, the guarantor of the salvation that is the Hellenic man, who is alone, isolated, and abandoned to the forces of chaos, has an enormous need for. Remember how I told you that a lot of the new religions of today, they all come from Hermes Trismegistus? This is what he's talking about right here. He's going into like all kinds of detail, tracing it back to the Anunnaki, to how it evolved through the Greeks into Latin, and so on and so on. This is exactly what he's talking about here. The Corpus Hermeticism introduces this new way of understanding divinity. It carries and reveals the message of a new way of relying on God in the uncertainties of the daily life. For its contents and the way they are treated, the corpus certainly is an esoteric work addressed to small groups of initiates, people who are able to understand the hidden meanings in the words of revelation. The Poimanders. The first treaty, in parentheses it says logos, of the Corpus Hermeticism is called Poimanders. This title is commonly translated as man's shepherd and indicates the typical figure of the God who intervenes in daily life with the aim of directing, guiding, protecting the flock, who without him feels lost at evil's mercy. The Poimanders thus bears the figure of the Savior that the people are awaiting. He is the Nous, the supreme mind, the Father who is spontaneously decides to reveal himself to the people through his intermediary. So why should God feel this need to intervene in human history and stand before his creatures? Because he loves man, and this is in parentheses, anthropos, the primordial man, the Adam of the Bible, made with his image and resemblance. This is the man who is guilty of a crime that makes him imperfect, the one who has become mortal in his body. This man is offered the opportunity of new and definitive salvation. He is to obey his shepherd's word and so walk the way that will unite him with his divine Father. At this point, it is very interesting to have a look at the description that Poimanders makes of this God revealing to man. In paragraph 5, we read the following statements. Tophos ikieno ego noos osos theos translates to the light that I mind your God. That is the light. I am the mind, am your God. It's got a bunch more translation. I believe this is all Latin here that he's translating. Mark can translate Latin. He can translate Hebrew. Like, this dude can translate everything. Well, maybe not everything, but Logos, Son of God, the one I am, from the luminous intellect of Logos, Son of God. There's a whole bunch of bullet points with a whole bunch of Latin words. I'll read some of them. I'm not going to read every single one because to en soy pon kai acuon Logos curio o de noas pater theos, translates to what in you observing and seeing Logos of God, instead mind Father God, what in you sees the observes is instead of mind of God Father, Logos of God. The next one reads, Father, the mind being life and light. Mind being life and light is the Father of all things. Of light and of life is made the Father of all things. The Father of all things is made of light and life. This one reads, the intellect, the saints, the good, the pure ones, the merciful pios, I, the intellect, am close to care for the saints, the good, the pure, the merciful, and the P-I-O-U-S. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. The presence mine is support. My presence is support. Will not let the falling forces of the body reach the end. I will not let the falling forces of the body reach the end. In 28, we find the call to conversion also present in the Gospels. And it is interesting to note how this concept is a new idea to a world that did not conceive the possibility of achieving immortality through repentance. Another translation down here, walking with in error, you walking in error must convert. Paragraph 31 introduces the prayer addressed to God, where, among other invocations, one also reads, Holy the God and Father of all things, holy is the God and Father of all things. His will is done, is accomplished by his powers. His will is done. Finally, 32 defines the relationship between God and man and clarifies that the final purpose of this revelation to mankind. And of his grace, I will enlighten men of ignorance, my brothers, sons of you, and of his grace will enlighten men of ignorance, my brothers, your sons. Because that was the end of all those Latin translations. The next section is entitled Tradition and John the Evangelist. It is important to note that the fathers of the church have repeatedly made reference to the context of the Hermetic doctrine from St. Augustine to Lactantius, this is hard to pronounce, Eusebius, St. Cyril, in order to defend Christianity from possible contaminations. This determines the large diffusion of the Hellenistic culture and how much it satisfied the needs of the historical period when people were living in the areas under the Roman Empire. Scholars consider John, the author of the fourth gospel, a theologian, a mystic, besides, of course, being one of Jesus' disciples. John is among the followers of the very beginning of the beloved disciple. Around the year 50 AD, the Apostolic Council of Jerusalem, Paul defines him as a church pillar. After having preached the gospel message far and wide, John settled in Ephesus in Asia Minor, where he died at the end of the 1st century. This gospel has therefore been written by a mystic during the final draft of the Corpus Hermeticum. The contemporary nature between the two compositions can perhaps explain some more concrete connections with regard to both the theological mystery established as well as the literal writing. But even if we don't want to necessarily find clear links, we cannot help wondering about the different influences impacting the two pieces of writing. Indeed, the doctrine contained in the Corpus Hermeticum were developed in the centuries preceding the advent of Jesus Christ and so are prior to any possible elaboration made by a mystic writer of the fourth gospel, whoever he was. It should be noted that the story of Christ for John is the beginning of a new era, an advent of a new age where the divine word was revealed to men. Jesus, who defines himself as the good shepherd of men, says, "I am the life, light, truth in this gospel." The narrated historical events are chosen on the basis of their specific value as quote-unquote signs, their symbolic and revealing meaning of the hereafter through a profound theological reflection. It is often a difficult language, intelligible not by anyone. A language that uses philosophical categories and cultural patterns typical to the educated classes of the period, those social classes able to grasp the hermetic and esoteric messages. It was these teachings and instructions that built up the deep religious syncretism we talked about earlier. Let's have a look at some passages from the fourth gospel that shows these coincidences that appear weird in a book that should be inspired by God himself. We have chosen to refer to the Greek text in order to get also the literal correspondences between this text and the aforementioned poimanders. This symmetry will help the reader catch the meaning of what we are going to discuss later. In the prologue of the Gospel, chapter 1, we read, and this is again translating Latin, "In the beginning was the Logos," which is the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Logos. All things came into being through him. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. We have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son. Full of grace and truth, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. Jesus and John the Baptist say, "Light has come into the world. The Father loves his Son, or loves the Son. All things has placed in his hand." Speaking of the mission of the Son and the power over death, Jesus says himself, "To my word, listening and believing has passed from death to life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd." Later in chapter 10, while defending himself from the accusations of blasphemy addressed by the Jews wanting to stone him, Jesus pronounces the supreme declaration that corresponds to what we read in Poimanders, where it is said that the Logos coming from God is the Son of God. John 10:36 we read, again going into the Latin, into English, "The one of whom the Father has sanctified and sent into the world, because I said, am I God's Son?" If you make a quick comparison to the quotations from Poimanders, there are many correspondences between the two texts which suggest a possible cultural and religious common basis. The author of the Gospel of John proceeds from a completely different bias, inspired by the story of a man named Jesus Christ, with whom for years he had lived with and shared experiences until his death. On this historical basis, consisting of both important and seemingly inconsequential daily life experiences, the author of the Gospel inserts his physiological and religious speculations, which have much in common with the corpus hermeticum generally speaking, and particularly with Poimanders. Hence come the doubts, and hence the question arises about the origin of the supposed inspiration which led to the writing of his text that Christian religion believes to have been dictated by God himself. Next it says, possible influences with a question mark. The Bible tells us about beings that have come from other worlds and created mankind. Over the centuries, these beings have been transformed into divinities, and original plurality has been reduced to a single God. Meanwhile, we can't help noticing that the author of the fourth gospel, the most spiritual one, is steeped in Hermetic culture. He loves to use mental and literary categories full of symbolism, of difficult allegorical interpretation. This is why it seems reasonable to ask questions, first of all, the ones that entitles this chapter. We're going to go into a bunch of bullet points with some questions. Are the mystical and theological elaborations of the author of the fourth gospel truly and clearly of divine inspiration, directly dictated by God, or rather are they the product of the times? Obviously, the product of the times. Aren't there more seemingly a mystical reading of historical events that occurred some 50 to 60 years before the writing of the book? Are they perhaps a reinterpretation made by the light of the same teachings that have been inspired or that have inspired other works written in the same historical and cultural moments? Might they be a result of educated thought looking for new, concrete, and persuasive answers to mankind's anguish, considering that mankind had for centuries no longer enjoyed the direct relationship with deities and therefore desperately trying to create it again? Hence is the truly divine inspiration for the so-called Holy Scriptures. In this attempt at reconstructing a spiritual divinity that could replace the missing material gods, it seems fairly clear that different cultures did collaborate in an effort to create a universal figure which could at least suit the Hellenistic world. We thus assist to a mutual interchange between the newborn Christian doctrines and the classical culture, which has had a considerable influence in later centuries. Just think of the preaching of one of the most important fathers of the 4th century church, St. Ambrose. His sermons of Neoplatonic inspiration were based on one of the major works produced by that philosophy, Plotinus' Enneads, a true compendium of philosophical doctrines drawn from the thought of the Greek philosopher Plato. The differences. Of course, between the fourth gospel and the other Hellenistic writings, there are also deep differences about the concept of God. The eschatological view of the human destiny of the path of growing in choosing his faith, but these do derive from the different historical and speculative bases generating the religious reflection. For example, in Poimanders, the soul that follows the word of divine guidance lives a mystical experience and undertakes a sort of astral travel during which it runs through 7 planetary spheres to reach the heaven of the fixed stars called Ogdoad. It then joins the other blessed ones and reaches its final goal, represented by the regenerating union or reunion with God without having to go through the experience of death. Also, different were the goals. The disciple John, as he himself had chosen on the basis of his personal experience, was to deliver his readers a specific message with reference to a figure of that master he was bound to for some years. To do so and to convince the skeptics of what he claimed, he had to use those forms of contents characteristics of the time, revising the figure of Christ in the light of the doctrines most widely used and accepted by those social classes to which he was addressing. So, basically, this is describing that John was just manipulating his text in a way that was sophistry, or rhetoric, the sophisticated use of language in order to manipulate a consciousness. We cannot blame him for this choice, but at the same time, we cannot help but ask a few questions. Did the God Christians are asked to believe in really reveal in the forms we know? On what basis should we believe in John's logos instead of the corpus hermeticums? Or hermetisms. I think it's hermetisms. Brief reflections on esotericism in the Jewish Christian doctrine. The Gospels of John is not the only text containing elements that suggest a link between Christian doctrine and the esoteric and hermetic culture of the time. In Matthew 7:6, Jesus explicitly says, "Do not give the holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you." This expression is interpreted by many as a clear and severe call not to indiscriminately spread the knowledge, not to disclose the secrets of profound wisdom to an audience unable to understand it and therefore likely to turn the message against the people or the same people who have conveyed it. But isn't this exactly what happened? Hasn't the church begun the largest development ever since it became a mass religion, losing its connotations as mystery and occult initiator? Yet it is Jesus himself who openly reveals his desire to talk to few, to communicate only with those who are able to understand, to unveil the true knowledge only to those who are able to receive it. When disciples would ask him why he talked in parables, he used to answer, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to those was not given, because seeing, watching, they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand." Then the evangelist continues supporting this Christ's last statement with a quotation from Isaiah's prophecy that in this respect is worthy of being paid attention. In chapter 6 of this book, the prophet tells us his prophetic vocation occurring in the presence of God, who is seated on a high throne, covered with a coat, whose edges covered the temple that was filled with smoke, while 6 winged seraphims were above him, screaming, "Holy, holy, holy, Yahweh, Sevaot." Isaiah offers his availability to God, who tells him, there's a little tiny writing down here again, "Go and say to this people, keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Cover with grease the heart of his people, and its ears weigh down, make dull, and in his heart do not comprehend, in turn, convert and heal for him," or heal to for him. This very severe statement gives a certainty that few people are able to receive the word, in parentheses, logos, and there will be a holy progeny. The same message is also recorded in the 2 other books, Mark in chapter 4:10 through 12, and Luke in chapter 8:10. And it says, in conclusion, in several writings, we find parallels between the so-called revealed books and the works of the period thinkers, which marked by the examination and controlled disclosure of those esoteric doctrines. Still, in the figure of Christ and in the entire history of the origin of the Jewish people's monotheism, there are elements that contribute to doubting about the supposed, quote-unquote, divine revelation of the so-called holy books. However, the task of this book is not to make a detailed analysis of the relationship between the religion and the thought which constitutes the original esoteric nucleus of all great religions. Here we want to understand if our doubts do have concrete foundations, to analyze those coincidences which are some strange and sometimes enlightening, to highlight all the incongruities that have compelled us to ask, is it possible that the Bible as a whole has been truly inspired by God, or the one God? And then up here in the next part it says, Thoth and the Judeo-Christian thought. We now analyze the figure of Thoth and some other curious parallels between the wisdom he passed on from the origins of Jewish and Christian religions. According to the Egyptians, this god knew all mysteries and wisdom and could dispense them to a few initiates he would choose. He himself wrote this secret knowledge in 36,533 rolls, hidden underground for the benefit of future generations. Thoth was also often depicted in the Hall of Judgment and in the act of judging the souls that appeared before him after death. This god, then, was legislator and judge accordingly in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There is a formula that all souls had to speak before him in the last judgments. In that decisive moment, the dead souls, besides other things, had to say, I have not despised God, I have not killed, I have not committed fornication, I have not robbed, I have not violated someone else's woman, I have not cursed, I have not borne false witness. You know, I don't know if I truly believe that people get their souls get judged by Thoth. I mean, that might have been just a bunch of propaganda, a bunch of fear mongering that was installed into the Egyptians, and you know they put these big paintings and on these big giant megalithic structures and these hieroglyphs to try to make it look all righteous and of highly advanced technology, you know, and it's kind of like a power flex, the way that they built all those structures and carved them with all the hieroglyphs, and then you got these godlike figures of like Thoth and Yahweh and all Enki, Enlil. You got all these all these players out on the field. Some of them are just trying to grab as much power as they can and win over the people by any means necessary. How can we fail to immediately grasp the almost literal correspondence between this confession and some of the commandments which God which God gave Moses at Mount Sinai? We, of course, are yet remembering that the Egyptian Book of the Dead is about 2,000 years older than the Bible. Coincidences become even more amazing if we consider that while the Old Testament tells us that Moses' tablets of law were written by God on a stone, in the Book of the Dead, we read that this chapter was found on a brick placed under Thoth's feet and was written by this God himself. In the same Egyptian work, there is another really disconcerting expression for its affinity with one of the central elements of Christianity, the Eucharist. Indeed, chapter 102 reads, to have eternal life, communicate with my consecrated bread, and later on drink my wine, its plants sprout over Osiris's body. In this regard, it is interesting to note that Osiris and Thoth were often identified in Egyptian religion, and that Osiris is the god who is killed, resurrects, and then from his body makes wheat and new life rises. It's just like that story of like the Last Supper, where Jesus is like, "This is my body, this is my bread," and basically like encouraging the disciples to drink his blood and eat his body, which is like cannibalism to me. It's just really weird that you get all these these parables that sound almost similar from all these different deities that have different names, but the mythology spreads over just thousands and thousands of years, and it looks like they just all intertwined them and intermingled the stories and confused them, and then boom, out pops religion out of it, and they just use it to control and manipulate people. Osiris is not the only figure whose divinity finds its proof in the ability to win over death. For example, Dionysus, Adonis, Tammuz, the Phoenician Adonis, Demeter, celebrated in the Eleusinian mysteries, Mithras, who was worshipped in Rome as Sol Invictus, the sun winning over death's darkness, and whose birth was celebrated on December 25th. All of these gods were whose death and resurrection were annually celebrated. They would guarantee the return of light and life after the winter's darkness, which represents death. It's all astrological there. The God who guarantees rebirth for his followers by providing them with food is not a prerogative for Christianity. The Indian Brahmins taught that the rice bread offered to the deity during the sacred ceremony would become God's real flesh. The Aztecs celebrated a real rite of communion, convinced that they were eating God's flesh. They consumed bread made of maize, beet, and honey, which had been consecrated during special ritual ceremonies. The doubt and the unacceptable hypothesis. Inspired by God or inspired by Thoth? The question does not pretend to affirm such an unrealistic alternative a non-existent rivalry between the two gods in the run for the authorship of the quote-unquote sacred books, or at least these books that are considered as sacred. The question only wants to justify the doubt that appears likely to rise and wants to be a reminder of the responsibility for those who pretend to say with absolute and unequivocal certainty that these books are quote-unquote sacred because they are directly inspired by the same God of whom they are the spokesperson. Too many elements make them similar to their other texts, other faiths, and other religion's fundamental constituents. Let us try to formulate a hypothesis about the real origin of the texts we are interested in. It is very easy to imagine an aging John, aware of the fact that life is slipping away, intent to look into the archive of his memories. Fears, doubts, perplexities, and distressing questions come over him. What will become of Jesus' words, he who lived many years earlier? What is the meaning of his death now that all those who knew him and were in the direct witness to his outstanding life are dying? Have those years of prayers, meditation, talking about God, walking long distances, eating crops from the fields, and sleeping anywhere all passed in vain? Have the doctrinal fights against Pharisees, hypocrisy been useless? Are those years now only a memory of a wonderful attempt that has miserably failed? Had Jesus really lived for nothing, who would intervene in the daily lives of the poor countrymen, relieve pain, erase the small and large anguishes of the people, who, although ruled by foreign barbarians, felt quote-unquote chosen by God? This could not be so. Several times in various parts of the known world, John had told the story of this great man, so great that he could not be considered simply a man. He had special light inside, enabling him to speak as even the greatest teachers of law could not do. He would accuse, reproach, and forgive with an authority that did not pertain to any of his predecessors. He could still feel satisfaction in recalling the anger of the conformists who saw them attending banquets with publicans, sinners, and prostitutes. What subtle pleasure it was to violate the arid and absurd traditional laws while silently supporting, through behavior, the strength of a new, shocking message. How could one let go the story of a man who lived so extraordinarily? It was nice to live with those certainties. They made you feel master of your own life. In those days, nothing could disturb the sincerity and power that arose from the certainty of the imminent coming of the kingdom of God. Over the years, and in John's preachings, memories crystallize on those events that have marked the milestones of a journey that began with the baptism in the Jordan and finished on the Golgotha. Certain events are called to mind and reviewed in the light of what a religious spirit needs absolutely to believe. Speeches take on a new and perhaps deeper meaning and enriched with content that develops through time. New thinking, along with comparisons and contributions from other doctrines, seem to facilitate the understanding of what sometimes seems pointless. Jesus could not die a second time, and he could not disappear with the death of the last witness of his life. What real chance had they to communicate this message to the educated classes, the initiates, and the connoisseurs, or the connoisseurs, sorry, there's a weird word there, of the mystery doctrines, a message that came from the obscure nation under the Romans, preached by even more obscure inhabitants of the little village, virtually known to Israel itself? What opportunities did this good novel have to be heard and accepted by people accustomed to other doctrines? Hence the need arose to make the preaching of this Hebrew carpenter who had no title for speaking to humanity. Hence the need to tie Jesus to the ancient and mysterious tradition of major initiates. We talk about, Hermes Trismegistus. Hence, the decision to feature him within those categories and might credit him and make him acceptable. Very interesting stuff. And then I think, okay, now we got one more conclusion here. All right, this next chapter is just titled "In Conclusion." So, I'm gonna stop the video and then we'll continue with this next chapter called "In Conclusion."